Well, greetings, friends, and welcome. My name is Rob Breakenridge. So great to have you along with us for this episode of the podcast. We got a lot to get into. It was a pretty big day Thursday in Canada, specifically in Vancouver, and then later in the day in Calgary, culminating with the proposal being officially submitted by Alberta to the Federal Major Projects Office to build a new 1 million barrel per day oil pipeline to the West Coast. Now, a lot of that was shaped by what happened earlier in the day as the Prime Minister paid a visit to Vancouver to meet with BC Premier David Eby. There's a new agreement in place between Ottawa and BC. There's federal support for LNG projects, for infrastructure in BC. BC is going to benefit as well from this pipeline. One of the trade-offs, though, is that the West Coast tanker ban will remain in place, which would preclude a pipeline project from going to the north coast of BC. So that really only leaves a southern route. And that's what we got in the announcement Thursday night in Calgary. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and Prime Minister Mark Carney, all smiles, making this big announcement. Indeed, Alberta will propose this pipeline to the West Coast that will more or less follow the right-of-way of the Trans Mountain Pipeline and will end at Roberts Bank in Delta, BC. Now, maybe this makes it a lot easier, a lot simpler to get this pipeline built, and hopefully that can happen more quickly. But still, there are a lot of questions around all of this. The price tag of this project, who's going to foot the bill for this project, how much private sector involvement there will be in building this project. And on the other side, when it comes to one of the other conditions, this Pathways carbon capture project, how's that going to move forward? Are the big players in the oil sands willing to partner on that? Are they also going to increase production to the extent that's necessary to fill this pipeline? There's some huge opportunity here and some massive economic benefits that a project like this can deliver. But obviously, as we're learning, it's not easy to do this. I think now that we've got this process in place, we've got this route in place that is kind of the simplest and the easiest of all options, there should be no excuse now. We'll have to see how this all plays out. So we'll get some further analysis of this announcement, everything else that transpired on Thursday, including a pretty big data center announcement in Alberta amid everything else. We'll hear from Heather Exner-Pirot of the macdonald-laurier Institute coming up in just a second. Let me play for you, though, a little bit of what we heard Thursday night in Calgary at this big announcement from Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. But first here from Prime Minister Mark Carney.
Now, this evening, I'm very pleased to join Premier Smith here in Calgary to announce new measures that will unlock Alberta's energy for the world. These measures will build the strength of our entire country. They will take control of our future. They will bolster our sovereignty. Today's announcements, and this is a lowball figure. You don't normally get lowball figures from politicians. This is a lowball figure. Canadians' announcements will catalyze well over $200 billion in direct investments in Canada, create over 175,000 new jobs across the country, and we are just getting started. It's the kind of unity and collaboration that Albertans and Canadians rightly expect. They expect it on principle, and they expect it because it's required for Canada to prosper in a rapidly changing world. You asked for it, we promised it, now we are delivering. Because when we work together, Canada controls its future. This is a new approach that helps us reach our full potential. Critically, what we've agreed is that the time for action is now. We will refer a submission that I may receive, Alberta's West Coast pipeline project proposal immediately to the Major Projects Office. Consultations will begin immediately with Indigenous communities, relevant provinces and territories to determine listing under the Building Canada Act by October 1st, as per our agreement.
This is transformational wealth, an opportunity neither Canada nor Alberta can afford to leave unrealized, which is why I'm happy to stand here today and say that Alberta's government has formally filed our West Coast oil pipeline submission to the Federal Major Projects Office for project of national interest listing under the Building Canada Act. This submission is the result of months of intensive work, bringing together world-class technical expertise, engineering analysis, economic modeling, and early engagement with Indigenous communities and partners. After studying both northern and southern route options, Alberta selected a southern route from Bruderheim, Alberta, to a deep-water VLCC-capable port terminal on BC's southwest coast. With the help of our technical advisory group made up of industry experts, we determined that this route offers the fastest, most cost-effective path to expanding Canada's energy exports. There is no doubt whatsoever that this pipeline is a project of national interest, one that will help connect Alberta oil to global markets and strengthen our country's economic future for decades. The West Coast Oil Pipeline will transport more than 1 million barrels of oil per day to Canada's West Coast and strengthen access to growing Asian markets, helping to meet Alberta's goal to double oil production to 8 million barrels per day over the next 10 to 15 years. Alberta's government is also finalizing another agreement with the federal government and the Oil Sands Alliance to significantly expand oil sands production and advance Pathways, the world's largest carbon capture and storage project. Doubling oil sands production is a big task. Doing so in the most environmentally responsible manner is an even bigger task, but this agreement will allow us to achieve both. Our oil sands partners will have the incentives they need to launch a super cycle of production growth in Canada's most valuable deposit of natural resources, and Pathways will make Alberta bitumen among the lowest emission heavy oil globally. We've certainly come a long way from talk of phasing out Alberta's oil and gas, haven't we? And together these efforts position Canada to deliver energy that the world needs, responsibly and competitively. The window of opportunity is open now. Recent global events have made it clear that Canada's safe and reliable sources of oil, gas, critical minerals are vital to the world's economy.
All right. Well, joining us now for more on the pipeline proposal, everything else on a pretty wild Thursday. Very pleased to welcome back here Heather Exner-Pirot, Senior Fellow and Director of Natural Resources, Energy and Environment at the macdonald-laurier Institute. Much more, of course, macdonald-laurier.ca. Heather, so great to have you with us here.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Rob.
So, like I say, I mean, a pretty wild day, a hugely significant day in a lot of ways, not just the proposal, this agreement with BC. There's a lot there. Of course, there was also a whole separate data center power announcement in Alberta on Thursday. What did you make of all of this happening all at once here?
Yeah, I mean, it was a great day for energy and for infrastructure. I've been calling it Super Thursday. And I don't know, we were all expecting that Pembina data center to be announced, in and around. I think they had said it by the end of Q2 before Stampede. But to have it all in the same day, and then to have Pembina also be involved in the pipeline later on, which I was not expecting. That was a big day for them. But obviously, when I heard that David Eby was coming back a day early from China for this, MOU or agreement with Canada, the same day as the pipeline announcement, I had a good sense that it was going to be a good day. I had a good sense that BC was going to get quite a few carrots as well. And that's absolutely what we saw. If there was doubt about Carney's intentions, I think after this day and after his video on Tuesday, his forward guidance, I think those have been dispelled.
Yeah, there's a lot that he's managed to weave together, and we'll see how well it all holds. But, this is all connected. I mean, even the data center, because this was one of the concessions from Ottawa, easing the clean electricity regulations. That sort of paves the way for this project. Now with BC, there's some concessions here, and there's LNG development. I think there's a lot of positives in that, but BC gets some benefits in exchange for sort of getting out of the way and not blocking this pipeline, which brings us to the route. And I guess we could maybe start there, because we had talked about, or certainly the Premier had talked about, the possibility of Kitimat or Prince Rupert, a northern route, which is closer to Asia. Instead, now we get this. So what did you make of that compromise?
Yeah, and it's been floated out there, for a while that maybe there's a southern route. The feds had said that they had preferred a southern route. I mean, I had been hearing rumors in the last week that maybe it's going to be this. And if you can look back retrospectively the last 2 months, you can kind of see the pieces going in that direction. Alberta had the website for the Northwest Coast Oil Pipeline about 2 months ago. It changed to a West Coast Oil Pipeline. You had the announcements on protecting orca populations in the south of Vancouver. When Prime Minister Carney was there for soccer in Vancouver, you saw that he was meeting with First Nations. So I guess it was leading that way. Alberta had always preferred the northern route because they have more deep water ports. And the very big constraint with the Burnaby terminal, the current Trans Mountain expansion terminal, is that it only holds what we call an Aframax. It's a smaller oil tanker vessel. And if you really want to get in the big leagues, especially when you're crossing the entire Pacific, you kind of need the very large crude carriers, the VLCCs. And Prince Rupert, Kitimat, those could accommodate those. And so I did think if it's a southern route, the quid pro quo is going to be that the feds are going to be the ones to pay to make that port at Delta, the new Roberts Bank terminal, capable of hosting those VLCCs. And when I heard it was a $10 billion investment into Roberts Bank terminal yesterday morning, I thought, okay, this is how this is going to go down.
So, I mean, in exchange, and as the Premier herself said last night, look, this is probably the fastest route in terms of getting this built. So the quickest to completion, and likely the simplest and easiest in terms of pushback and opposition and whatever else might have entailed going to the North Coast. So how meaningful are those aspects?
Yeah, I mean, I think on paper that, if you were just starting from scratch and there was no politics and no baggage, I think that northern route still makes the most sense. But politics is a real thing. We do live in the real world. And the politics, we know that costs billions and billions of dollars when the politics are not in your favor, when you have to face legal delays, when there's opposition, ruins the atmosphere around building a new pipeline. And so there is value to going on a route that doesn't have that opposition. And obviously we've already done the TMX, and I don't think it's been emphasized enough. The head of the major projects office now is Don Farrell, who was the CEO of the TMX and kind of got it over the finish line. So even in the Building Canada Act and the regulatory reforms, you could see, the fingerprints of Don Farrell on a lot of these things. I don't think it's a surprise that she became the head of the major projects office when they wanted to get a West Coast pipeline, I think, ultimately built. And she knows, what needs to be done, really needs to. And then you have the beauty, I guess, or it's very, very good that the federal government already owns Trans Mountain and they can kind of tell it what to do. And so we heard yesterday also that although Pembina is coming on kind of as a partner and will contribute their expertise, you've checked the box for that private proponent. It is Trans Mountain that is going to lead this. And no kidding, because it's a new pipeline that's going to be, parallel to what they already manage.
Well, in Trans Mountain, I guess we still have what's basically almost like a crown corporation,
Yes.
Pembina, private sector coming on board. How much private sector involvement do we see here? And what do you think is still holding back? I mean, I think initially maybe there was a hope that it would be a larger consortium, there would be more private backers for this. Where's the hesitancy here, do you think?
Well, it's still very early days, and I don't know that we won't see that again, but I was never expecting a private proponent to come here on day one. It's only just been submitted to the major projects office. It hasn't, it has not been approved. It has not gone through the regulatory process. It has not fulfilled the duty to consult and accommodate all the things that derailed Northern Gateway. I could say Keystone XL. Those are all still ahead of this pipeline. Now, so when you get the regulatory approval, when you get, the consent or at least no opposition from the majority of First Nations, maybe that's a time where some equity firm or some pension plan comes in and says, yeah, I would come in on this. But I do think this isn't a typical asset. I think, and people need to appreciate, why is this so difficult to finance? It's enormous. And now we're floating numbers in the high 30s, let me say 38 billion, we don't know what it'll be. Trans Mountain was 34. It sounds like from the submission, this will be a little bit more. I think that includes the port. I don't think there's a company that can, on their own balance sheet, even an Enbridge is not going to be able to front $38 billion. This is too big for someone's, single expenditure, given what's happening in the rest of the world. So you do need a consortium. Even LNG Canada, phase one, 40 billion was a huge consortium, even though it was led by Shell, one of the biggest oil companies in the world. So I did think it was going to be consortium. I think people could come on later. What I really do expect, though, is some Asian customers to come on board, either with an offtake, which is something is financeable. If you have that guaranteed offtake, you can go to the bank with that, or as equity in the project itself, or as equity in some of the upstream production, so that this is for sure the venue that they're going to get their oil back home. So there's a lot more mileage, to this story. But I didn't expect that private one. I was actually surprised that they had Pembina coming on yesterday. Of course, that was non-binding, and we'll see how that plays out.
So is that going to mean taxpayer dollars initially backing this pipeline? Does Alberta have other avenues to finance this? Where's the money going to come from here initially?
Yeah, and again, I mean, we just saw what happened with TMX, so it's probably not a mystery. You have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. So it is a crown corporation, and we always say taxpayers paid for this, and that's not quite right. The government financed it. It's a liability on their balance sheet, but the payments are being paid by the tolls. So it's still the upstream producers that are shippers, we call them, using the pipeline that pay tolls to use the pipeline. We know in the case of TMX, those tolls are covering the cost of capital and interest and dividends. So even though I always think of it as a mortgage, in normal times, a pipeline company would probably want to pay off their mortgage in 12 years. These pipelines are so expensive, it's probably going to be 20 years. Let me, give or take. Someone probably knows the exact number. I'm guessing it's about 20 years to pay it off. So not something a pipeline company would normally sign on to. That's too long for them. But for a government with a AAA credit rating, that isn't, so big of a deal for a nation building project. So the tolls take care of the principal and the interest, a little bit of dividend, where you make the money, why this is worth it for governments, for Alberta to help finance it, for Canada to help finance it, is the royalties and the taxes. That's where you're getting tens and tens of billions of dollars back to you. So for Alberta, it's the royalties. For Canada, it's the corporate taxes. It's all the income taxes from all the work goes into it. It's the $100 billion plus of upstream investment you're going to get into the oil sands. Danielle Smith talked about that new super cycle, the oil sands 2.0 build out. And we know that had such a great effect on the Canadian economy back in the early 2010s. And then the last thing that people often don't think about is you're still going to maintain that narrower differential, that when we only had the one customer to the United States, they get it, as we say, at a discount. You didn't have optionality. You often had a very big gap between what we call the Western Canadian Select, the price of a Canadian barrel benchmark, and the West Texas Intermediate. We call that the differential. It was often very wide. The more optionality you have to Asian markets, the narrower it is. And so you're getting like $7 more for every barrel just because you have the option. And that is worth, I'm telling you, tens of billions of dollars to Alberta and to Canada.
It's interesting. I mean, I think the concern with TMX and now with this is the temptation where you get the Washington refineries right there. California is just kind of right around the corner. Do you still expect that most of what goes into this pipeline is going to be destined for Asian markets, or do we let the markets sort all of that out?
I mean, for sure you let the markets sort it out. But I think it was the expectation with TMX. Again, it's only been running for 2 years.
Yeah.
You really did think that most of it was going to go to California and to the United States. And part of it, I think, was because of the Aframax size of vessel. And it turns out that the majority has been going to China, and most of it has been going to Asia. And so that was, a surprise. And obviously now they've been able to use Canadian heavy crude, put it into the refineries, see if they like it. They do like it. And so now that's why, they are, coming to Canada. Canada's coming to them to talk about how much more of this Trans Mountain expansion. First of all, we're going to get an extra 300,000 barrels out of the existing Trans Mountain pipeline. And then who wants to come on board for the 1 million barrel pipeline? And hearing a lot of them at the Global Energy Show, a lot of them are, 90% dependent on Middle Eastern molecules. And with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, that is too much of a dependency. And so even without growth, they would want to displace some of their current product with a Canadian product. But we know that India is going to lead the world in growth. Southeast Asia is going to come next. There's a huge appetite. I don't think it's going to be that hard to find 1 million barrels into that Asian market.
Mm-hmm. So I guess with TMX, I mean, that kind of came when we faced a bit of a capacity crunch. So it was, that there was product to go into that pipeline, basically. I think the question now, as we build this 1 million barrels per day pipeline, is, are we going to have the development, the production to go along with that? And so that ties into this Pathways carbon capture project and getting some kind of agreement here with the big players. How do you foresee that unfolding?
Yeah, and this is a very different situation in that we have announced, since the emissions cap was canceled, by the way, in November with that first MOU, You had Enbridge say, okay, we're going to do the mainline expansion. That's 400,000 barrels. You had Trans Mountain say, we're going to do our expansion, 300,000 barrels. And then you had, the Keystone XL Redux, kind of the South Bow Bridger pipeline, with originally 550 at first and up to 1 million. And so pipelines the private sector has come up with many pipeline proposals. You have to fill that. By my math, it's about 1.3 million barrels. That's a lot. And so the question was, can we fill those 1.3 million barrels, which will come first, and the second million barrel pipeline, which comes with the price tag of, the Pathways project? And the interesting thing is, we have been, when people wonder why Canadian oil and gas production kept going up and up, despite Trudeau's policies, whatnot, it was because we've been dining out on the oil sands build out of the early 2000s and the 2010s. And they just expand incrementally, and there's brownfield expansion. Eventually, you get to the end of that. And we're seeing that with that big West Coast million barrel pipeline, that is going to require some greenfield oil sands development. And so and that's more expensive. That's why it matters. The brownfield, you're probably breaking even at $40 a barrel. The greenfield expansion is probably $55 to $65 a barrel. So a very different market structure that you need to fund it. And that was the question that the oil sands had. Of course, they didn't show up at the presser at that second MOU a month ago, with the industrial carbon price announced. Well, yesterday, Danielle Smith said there is a tripartite agreement. We have developed enough incentives that the oil sands companies feel confident that they can fill this and that we're going to have another super cycle. And we're still waiting for details. They promised the details would show up in the next coming days. But that was the thing I was waiting for. I said before, we whittled down the sticks, but we didn't have any carrots yet. And it sounds like maybe we have some carrots here coming up.
Well, and I think that's where there's been nervousness around this MOU and where there are still costs on Alberta, the industrial carbon pricing and the Pathways project, which comes with a pretty massive price tag and some uncertainty around how that's going to be financed. Do the companies still believe in this concept? Can it actually work at scale? Do we have any more certainty on how this fits in?
Yeah, so Danielle Smith sounds confident that we have that certainty. Kendall Dilling, who is the head of the Oil Sands Alliance, contributed a quote, to the submission. So that's a good indication to me that we found a way. And it's not a big, what could it possibly be? We know what it was. We know what it was in the first oil sands build out. It's mostly accelerated capital cost allowances. So the ability to write off your expenditures immediately and not over a period of years. Trump did that with his, super tax cut and the big, beautiful build. That drew so much capital down south because, it's just this depreciation mechanism that really attracts capital, hoping to have it here. I thought Carney might announce it at his big investor summit in September, but maybe we'll have a better indication of what it's going to look like for the oil sands a little bit sooner than that.
And so now the process, right? And this is kind of unprecedented too, to have this new avenue for fast tracking these projects. So we're sort of still working our way through this or seeing what it looks like in practice. So the proposal has been submitted to the Major Projects Office.
Yes.
The understanding, I guess, is that consultation, will begin right away with First Nations and affected communities. And I guess by October, then the hope is, or the idea is, that it'll get this designation of being in the national interest. So what does that mean in practice, do we think?
Yeah, this is a great question because this isn't the same as regulatory approval. There's lots of projects that have been referred and they're not kind of ready for consultation. They aren't ready for approval. So that is a different thing. What it does is upfront says, the politics are in place. There's not going to be a veto at the cabinet level. There's not going to be a rejection, which is exactly what happened on Northern Gateway. It's pretty important upfront before you say, the Alberta taxpayer is going to commit, $50 million to, front end engineering and things like this, to know that there's not going to be rejected at the end of the day, to know what the conditions are. And so that is very helpful. Designating it in October with the Building Canada Act means that there are certain legislations, and I would say, some species at risk, it's kind of Orwellian stuff. Of course, no one wants to kill off a species. But for example, on Trans Mountain, this is the quintessential example where there was a hummingbird nest, very common species, not endangered. It was in the line of route. You can imagine how big your line of route for a pipeline is, maybe 40 meters across. And because of those hummingbird nests, they had to stop construction for 6 months. And we live in Canada. There's only construction season for 6 months. And so, and it's because of migratory birds, laws and that kind of thing. So those kinds of things where you say, this is not worth it, kind of those more Orwellian or, where just the cost and the benefit just do not align. And when you look at the Building Canada Act, I know, again, you can see, if you want to, the fingerprints of Dawn Farrell over the kinds of legislation that was chosen, the reforms that were advanced. Having in mind her experience, I must anticipate of Trans Mountain behind her. So it was almost, for me, that Building Canada Act C5 almost perfectly developed to allow a new West Coast pipeline to go ahead without some of the crazier things that that choked up TMX when it was getting built.
And then just to bring it back to where we started, everything else that we saw unfold yesterday. I mean, this BC agreement. I know there's the focus on the tanker ban remaining in place and some of these political trade-offs, but I think still, I mean, even from a national perspective, we almost take for granted now that we're actually developing LNG and export capacity. So some announcements to move that along, these infrastructure upgrades, the port upgrades, which are so crucial. I mean, that was, I think, a lot of good news. And then, of course, too, and you've been talking about the importance of attracting this data center investment, getting some of these regulatory hurdles out of the way so Alberta can move forward. This announcement we got yesterday from, again, Pembina about this power project, $4.6 billion. I mean, that's pretty big for Alberta, too.
Yeah. And that's just the power plant, because the data center itself is going to also be billions of dollars. And yeah, we are taking for granted LNG. It was part of the announcement, almost because I feel like everything has already been moved to make LNG possible. There aren't really any corners left, certainly not from BC, certainly not from Ottawa, that are opposed to LNG, not from First Nations. So I don't know what much more concretely they can do to make that happen, but that I think they're already making it happen. But the port upgrades are very important. And part of the port upgrades now looks like it's going to be for tankers, for VLCCs out of Delta. But for everything else, when you talk about our grains and our oil seeds and our critical minerals, the potash, the metallurgical coal, those things have been hampered by inefficiencies and congestion at the Port of Vancouver. And so our most important port, our biggest port, our gateway to Asia, 4.5 billion people, hungry for more raw materials. We're a raw materials exporter. That is very important, to fix up the ports. And out of all this, there's still the regulatory reforms that have, we've had a discussion paper. We expect legislation to be proposed very early in September that are also meant to make the ports and the railroads more efficient on the labor side. And so I do see the plan. I don't think you have to be very generous in your interpretation to say, I do see the Carney government making these steps to improve our ability to export to Asia and improve our ability to develop all these raw materials.
Yeah, so still a ways to go. I guess really we're kind of just almost like at the end of the beginning in a way, but reason for optimism, you think?
Yeah, I'm optimistic, and I joked, was Carney angling to be the marshal of the Stampede Parade? Because there was a lot of goodies that were given, and this will benefit in billions of dollars for the Alberta taxpayer. That is for sure. Like, we will get tens of billions of dollars in royalties and taxes from this. Great jobs. Imagine another oil sands super cycle in this province. Imagine on top of that a data center cycle in this province. So there are great things ahead. Of course, we've had, probably too many government announcements, not enough private sector announcements. But with the data center, with this promise of the Oil Sands Alliance coming on board saying, they think they can raise $100 billion to fill these pipelines. That's very promising stuff.
Well, nice kickoff to Stampede Weekend in Calgary for sure. Much more is mentioned, macdonald-laurier.ca. Heather, really appreciate the insight and the overview of all of this. Thanks again for making some time for us here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rob.
All right. Our thanks once again to Heather Exner-Pirot, Senior Fellow and Director of Natural Resources, Energy and Environment at the MacDonald-Laurier Institute. Great overview of everything that went down Thursday. And I think she's right. I think there's reason to be optimistic here about all of this moving forward. I think there's a real willingness and an appetite to move forward on these projects. Certainly the public support is there. The economic impetus is definitely there. And I think that's probably in turn why there is public support. Canadians are worried about the economy, worried about trades. And we see these opportunities, we see these strengths that we have. So really now's the time to take advantage of that. So it's unfortunate that it's so convoluted to do all of this, but at least I think there's a willingness to do this. So we'll see how this all unfolds going forward. I think that's the other thing in Alberta is the political factor here. I think this is a pretty big win for Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. I think all of this is ultimately, assuming it goes ahead, a real positive for Alberta. And of course, it comes at a time when it's a pretty important political moment. With a referendum coming up in October and a question on the ballot that could affect Alberta's future in Confederation. So I don't know that it all hinges on this project necessarily, but I think showing that this is possible, I think demonstrating that we can build these projects, that there's that win-win for Alberta and for Canada in doing this. I think that goes a long way in showing Albertans that Confederation works, that we can do big things as a country. And I do think that matters. I think there will be, it probably is, some skepticism about all of this. Is this really going to happen? Or some questions about why it's so expensive, or why government has to be so involved, or why Alberta has to be so dependent on the federal government to make this happen. But I think wouldn't Alberta much rather see the federal government use this ability, this power to move projects like this forward, instead of getting in the way or blocking or stymieing those kinds of projects? So I think that's going to be the argument that's put forward by Danielle Smith and by Federalists in this campaign and in this conversation. So that's the other factor here, right? Is what is the political impact in Alberta in terms of this referendum? And I think also in terms of Danielle Smith and the UCP and their own political fortunes. How much of a win is this for them? How does this affect going into next year in an election year? It is worth noting, by the way, that the Alberta NDP, their reaction to this announcement was basically saying, great, this is good news. We applaud this. We support this. I think which shows where the conversation is at in Alberta around these projects and the benefit of developing these kinds of projects. So again, it was an eventful and I think a consequential day Thursday in both Vancouver and Calgary with national implications. And now we'll see where it all goes from here. So stay tuned. We'll have much more, I'm sure. In the meantime, again, hopefully everyone had a great Canada Day. I guess it's kind of spilled over almost like a Canada Day long weekend, but not quite. So do appreciate you joining us on the podcast here this week. You can find us, of course, our YouTube channel, Rob Breakenridge Show. You can find this podcast on the podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, and the rest. And of course, our website, robbreakenridge.ca. Again, thanks so much for joining us here this week. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend. We will talk to you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with the Rob Breakenridge Show.